Okay. Just ring him in properly. Better quality of resolution on the background there. I can actually see the books. Okay, so the USSR was not state capitalism, and he asks us what bureaucracy is.
State capitalist notion. Well, this is out there, right? It's what they call the third camp Trotskyites generally put this out, but other people put it out as well, right? The idea is that Trotsky, he didn't like Stalin. He declared that the USSR under Stalin was what he called a degenerated worker state.
No, he called it a deformed worker state.
In New York City, they call them the New York intellectuals. There's actually
the New York. Oh wow, nice dog whistle there. The New York intellectuals. We've gone from the international bankers to the New York intellectuals. Also, yeah, I'm kind of curious to see if he points out that the reason that people came to refer to the system in the Soviet Union as state capitalism was that it literally was capitalism, except the government fucking did it. I mean, you had wage labor to produce commodities, and workers didn't control the means of production. That was why. It wasn't just Trotsky didn't like Stalin, and not that I'm actually all that impressed with Trotsky, to be completely honest, but on this, he's not wrong.
This is a whole book about them, actually, which I draw heavily from in my synthetic left research. It's called The New York Intellectuals by Alan M. Wald.
Okay, now I have to look this up. The new... That immediately just... Let's see. Who is this guy? Professor Emeritus of English. Okay. Okay. Okay, he's not dodgy, even though that term sounds dodgy as fuck. Coming from Caleb Maupin.
There's a whole history of this grouping in New York City. They called the New York intellectuals Trotskyites who broke with Trotsky. And they said, no, the Soviet Union's not a degenerated worker state. It's not a deformed worker state. The Soviet Union is state capitalism. That was the New York intellectuals, they were called. Max Shachtman was probably the most influential figure among them. There was also James Burnham. There was also Martin Aburn. There was, who else? There was, and eventually...
I am just dying to know if he's going to give a halfway accurate synthesis of what they were, what the view is, what their reasoning was.
You got Susan Sontag, you got Irving Kristol, the father of neoconservatism, but they broke with Trotsky. And Tony Cliff in the UK, very good one, Joseph, right, and they argued that the Soviet Union was state capitalism. State capitalism. In the Soviet Union, there was a new ruling class called in the state, and they were exploiting the workers, and the Soviet Union was capitalism, just everything was run by the state. Well, the problem with that argument is that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what capitalism is.
Oh, I can't wait to hear.
Capitalism is not simply one group of people owning and controlling the means of production. It's one group of people owning and controlling the means of production to make profits.
No, to make commodities for exchange. With the idea that the exchange is meant to be profitable.
Let me emphasize that. Frederick Engels said that under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital, meaning houses only get built so money can be made off them. food is only grown, so money can be made off of. Under capitalism, profits are in command, as Mao said. Capitalism is a system of production organized for profit. So simply saying that in the Soviet Union, which is true, there was a party elite, there was a party bureaucracy, there was a nomenclatura, or how do they? What's the correct word for it? There's some, there was a group of people in the party. There were party elites.
Funny thing is that the nomenclatura is actually a term that was largely popularized in the English language. It was not so much of a Russian term.
I had nicer cars than other people. Simply saying that existed does not prove it's capitalist.
Well, no, but of course that's the thing, that they didn't just simply say that. The point is that the entire the working class did not control the means of production, and production was for to generate exchange value, for which workers only got a small fraction of the value that they created. I mean, if you're gonna argue against it, at least state it correctly.
Because capitalism is production organized for profit, not saying that, there was this group of people who had, disproportionate power and a little more, wealth than other people, right?
Well, why don't we approach this from another direction, Caleb? Because the reason that we got to state capitalism, because it was that it isn't socialism, because socialism actually requires the working class to actually control the means of production. And that shit wasn't happening, except for like 5 minutes in about 1918.
Bureaucrats, maybe they had bigger houses, maybe they had bigger cars than everybody else, but they weren't, gazillionaires and millionaires and billionaires, right?
Oh, so that's the idea, that they only later became gazillionaires. Because that is actually the class from which the current Russian oligarchs were largely derived. But no, it's not a matter of how much you make. It's a matter of who controls the means of production.
They lived better than average workers did, no question about it. But their money, their wages came out of the same surplus that everyone's wages came out of, right?
That's not what a surplus is.
They were bureaucrats. They were not capitalists.
Well, except here's the problem with that, because the whole idea was that the new capitalist class was the bureaucracy. Because that was who controlled the means of production and decided what was done with the... Well, yeah, I mean, all the time he spends with Russians, it hasn't rubbed off on him in one bit, apparently. I mean...
The capitalist's interest is contrary to the interest of his employees.
Yes, just as the interests of this bureaucratic class were contrary to the interests of the workers.
The lower the worker gets paid, the more money the capitalist makes.
Yeah, exactly. And as you just pointed out yourself, the pool of money from which the bureaucratic capitalist class in the Soviet Union compensated themselves was the same one from which the workers received their wages. So the more wages the workers had, the less was left over for the capitalists.
The higher the wage of the worker, the less profits the capitalist gets. The capitalist wants to drive the wages of his employees down so that he can maximize his own profits. The worker wants to maximize his own wages, and that cuts in.
Are you hearing the video okay, by the way? I mean, it's... I just want to make sure because it's a bit quiet on my end. Oh, hell, now I'm turning the volume down more.
The capitalist. There is a contrary interest. The capitalist wants to hire as few workers as possible to maximize his own profits. The worker wants to be employed, right? So there are contrary interests there. The Soviet bureaucracy wanted the Soviet people and Soviet society overall to become wealthier so that they could get wealthier and their position would be more solidified. right? That the definition of a ruling class, not a ruling clique, not a bureaucracy, not a privileged group, but a ruling class. A ruling class has contrary interests to other classes.
And as you just pointed out, Caleb, this is in just simple mathematical terms the case.
However, the Soviet bureaucracy had the same interests as the Soviet working class.
Well, yeah, except here's the thing. I mean, yeah, so what he's taking is their statements of aspirations. Well, yes, I mean, which of course included claiming to be aspiring to eventually reach communism, despite the fact that they were moving farther away from it every single year, starting in about 1917. But, I mean, you could actually use the exact same logic, and in fact, I mean, I've seen people do it, to claim that the likes of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos aren't exploiting workers. They don't have contrary interests because they want the good of humanity. I mean, this is just such crap. I'll turn it up a bit. Maybe I just turned it down when the music was... I turned it down too low when the music was on.
They had privileges. They had bureaucratic privilege. But, the fall of the Soviet Union, great example, right? The fall of the Soviet Union was the destruction of the Soviet bureaucracy. The Soviet...
No, it really... I mean, yes, in the sense that bureaucracy as a part of the state largely ceased to exist, yes. But the bureaucracy actually, especially the people at the top end of it, actually did quite well out of it. Because those were the people who benefited from the privatizations, and because of the way that the fucking economy was structured in the Soviet Union, it was relatively easy to privatize all of it.
The bureaucracy was broken apart, and Western capitalism set up shop in the former Soviet Union. Did that benefit Russian workers? No, right? If they were...
and yet it benefited this bureaucratic class is the thing there.
Were a separate class, right? If the bureaucracy of the former Soviet Union had been a separate class, right? If that class had been broken apart, it would have been good for the workers. Well, no.
Okay, so the idea is that if a class with... first of all, he's got this interesting notion of what it means for a class to be broken apart. But, okay, if the capitalist class is broken apart and replaced by feudal lords on the old model... that is going to benefit workers. The elimination of a ruling class in itself does not tell you anything about whether what comes after it is going to be beneficial. It depends what's replacing it, isn't it? And in this case, it was largely the same people becoming just straight up capitalists rather than state capitalists.
It was bad for them, right? I mean, that simply arguing that there is a privileged bureaucracy in a socialist state does not make it
How's it now?
Capitalism is production for profit. And in the Soviet Union, you had state central planning, and production was not carried out to make profits. It was carried out according to a state central plan.
Yeah, here's the problem with this again, because in capitalism, okay, unless the idea is that if it's specifically a state central plan, then it ceases to be capitalism, in which case we got a problem, because then you are essentially saying that much of the social democratic economies of Europe are not capitalist, because the state actually directly has, to some extent currently does, and certainly has at various times, controlled significant segments of the national economies of these countries, and of course, in that context, did operate to a plan that was generated by the state. But if you look at the way capitalist businesses are run, they are also planned. So, if the idea is that simply putting the state in there somehow makes it, then, I mean, then we get sort of the Bernie Sanders notion of socialism.
Right? The Soviet Union did all kinds of stuff that did not make profits for people.
Yeah, lots of capitalist systems do lots of stuff that don't make profits for people. I mean, George W. Bush managed to run his oil company that he got from his dad so that it didn't make profits and actually ended up going broke. That does not. And in capitalist economies where there is some state involvement, it is actually common to have certain industries that you run at a loss in order to just be countercyclical and uh, sort of act as an employer of last resort. So none of this, I mean, all of these are things that are features of economies like Britain, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. At some periods, the U.S., Germany. Lots of
That it was
this
good for
is
society
standard
overall, like building huge power
Keynesian
plants, like,
shit.
industrializing the whole country. They had a state central plan. They planned out their economy and carried it out. They didn't simply say, okay, okay, you're the bureaucrat and head of this industry. What'll make you more money? Okay, it's not how it worked. There was a state that capitalism is the rule of profits. Socialism is rational state central planning. The Soviet Union did not have a capitalist economy. It had a privileged bureaucracy. Great example. And actually, I think this comes from Trotsky, of all people. And I'm not a fan of Trotsky, but, Trotsky
Oh, well, you could have fooled
could
me.
spell these things out because he was not, in the Soviet government anymore. So he could speak more explicitly, right? The Soviet government, it was necessary for them to speak very carefully. They were representing the Soviet state.
And aside from that, if they had to actually bullshit people, or they would lose a little bit of that brand identity that they got by claiming to be socialist.
Trotsky, that's why I encourage people, as much as I don't like Trotsky and I denounce his theory of permanent revolution, there's a little more candor and honesty there, and there's a nitpicky criticism, but he understood how the Soviet Union worked because he helped build it. And Trotsky makes the analogy, I've made this analogy many times because it's accurate, of what is a bureaucracy.
Wait, a second ago you were going to give us an example. Now you're going to give us an analogy?
So, if you're building socialism in a country that is impoverished, right, in a country that has historically been poor, you're not going to have huge surpluses of food at first. There's going to be limited amounts of food. So you're going to have to ration the food and make sure that everyone gets some food. Make sure that one group of people doesn't get more food than other people and let other people starve. You're going to have to ration as you plan out the economy. You're going to have to say, okay, you get this much, and you're going to have to decide.
Yes, we understand what rationing is.
Who gets what. So if you're rationing the food to make sure that everyone gets.
Yes, please explain to us what rationing is again, just in case. I mean, we've only heard you explain it 4 times
gets
now.
Enough food, you're going to have a guard that makes sure that as they're handing out that bread to people, nobody cuts in the line and nobody punches somebody else and takes their bread. You're going to have a guard, somebody who's the guard who makes sure that the rules are enforced and that everyone gets their ration. But here's the problem.
Yes.
That guard is taking on way more responsibility than everybody else because he is taking on the responsibility of being the guard. He's not just one of the people in the line getting their little piece of food. He's taking on the responsibility of being the guard. So he's going to demand that, okay, fine, I'll be the guard, but I get a bigger slice of bread than everybody else because I'm taking on the line of being the guard. So he's going to get a bureaucratic privilege because he's the guard. That's the bureaucracy. But then the question becomes, how do you prevent the bureaucracy from just taking their bread and overturning socialism, right?
Well, by not having one. I mean, see, the thing about the underlying assumption of this entire analogy is that clearly the idea is that the rationing, the rules by which the rationing is carried out, all those decisions are being made by somebody other than the people who are looking for something to eat. It sounds very much like these rules were just sort of imposed, which is why there is some need to have somebody specifically charged with enforcing those rules by force.
How do you control the bureaucracy? And how do you prevent something like in the USSR? In the USSR collapsed because half the bureaucracy just threw in the towel. Half the government bureaucracy in the USSR, pretty big chunk of it, just said, you know what, yeah, we're done with this, and they threw in the towel and surrendered. How do you prevent that from happening? Well, Stalin and the 1930s Soviet Union, the way they prevented it was with a police state and Yezhovshchina, and they had a secret police, and if you were conspiring or something like that, you disappeared in the middle of the night. There was a police state apparatus. There was a highly politicized secret police that made...
And it is also the most explicitly capitalist period in the entire Soviet Union up until, like, about 1986.
Made sure that anyone who seemed like they were going to dismantle socialism or work against socialism was dealt with.
But even more so, the people who actually looked like they might be interested in building socialism. Because the thing is, if you've got socialism, there's really no room for some kind of a great leader to profit off of the entire thing. And for impose time motion studies on the working class.
That was one way of doing it. After Stalin's death, you have Khrushchev's secret speech, you have the bureaucracy becoming less and less revolutionary, and the Soviet Union eventually falls. Well,
less revolutionary than they were under Stalin?
What was another method? Mao had a different method of dealing with the bureaucracy. He said, we're going to mobilize society to constantly be kicking the bureaucracy's ass, the Cultural Revolution, right? We're going to mobilize mobs of Red Guard youth that'll constantly be terrorizing the bureaucracy. Are you a capitalist roader? And raiding their, and we're going to...
Which, okay, at a certain point, then it becomes a little... The question does arise of why the fuck do you have the bureaucracy in the first place, if then you're going to turn around and create another institutional structure that has the sole purpose of fucking around with the bureaucracy.
Instead of having a secret police do it, we're going to have a mobilization of mobs of people, and we're going to have like mob rule kind of to control and kick the ass of the bureaucracy. Well, that didn't turn out too well either. Didn't turn out too well, right? The Cultural Revolution was a nightmare. Mob rule, not good. Police state rule, not good. So how do you deal with this question of bureaucracy? This has been really the question that has defined 20th century communism. How do you deal with bureaucracy? How do you prevent the bureaucracy from doing what the Soviet bureaucracy did and surrendering?
Well, by preventing them from existing.
Well, China has found the answer. You create other ways for people to move up in society. You enable a market sector.
Oh, okay, so here's the idea is that, I didn't actually have this on my bingo card, that he was going to make this into some sort of explanation of how actually China is the one that does communism better, but that has actually been a subject that he's come back to a few times, so it shouldn't surprise me. I mean, because, really, what's not communist about China? I mean, you've got much of the workforce being used as a cheap labor platform for foreign manufacturers and social credit scores and the rest.
In the Soviet Union, the only way you could get ahead, the only way you could get more money than everybody else, was to get into the party bureaucracy. So a lot of people joined the Communist Party, didn't believe in communism, they just wanted a bigger slice of bread than everybody.
Indeed, the Bolsheviks as a whole were pretty ambivalent about communism from the start.
Well, that's a problem, isn't it? But in China, they said, okay, the Communist Party is for people who believe in communism.
Yes, like Jack Ma.
But if you just want to make money, go start a tech company. Go start a real estate company. And they
real estate speculation, totally the way to communism.
Created the market sector for the place for people that are just ambitious, just greedy, just want to get ahead. They go into the market sector. Meanwhile, the Communist Party remains only for people that are committed to communism.
Okay, the idea here is that by just having an explicitly capitalist sector of the economy, that how exactly? So you're combating the bureaucracy by just having straight up capitalists?
Communist Party becomes this ideological core, but people that just want to get ahead can go into the market sector, and the party controls the market sector. This is the method through which this problem of bureaucracy has been resolved.
It doesn't seem like it's been resolved.
That if the bureaucracy is the...
If your resolution is to just have actual literal capitalists and let them accumulate money and power, then, I mean, okay, I guess that's one way to. That's basically the way the Soviet Union ended up resolving the issue of the bureaucracy, too.
The only place where people can become wealthy, or the only place where people can, quote unquote, advance in a society, that's where the problem starts. Because, at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, about half the Soviet Communist Party didn't believe in communism. Right? So you have to make an area for social mobility to take place, for people to be ambitious, for people to get ahead in the market.
And how does this bring you closer to communism, though? I mean, that sounds like you're moving farther away from it, and you're essentially admitting that you have no way. I mean, the minute you start actually just opening up large amounts of your economy to just straight up explicit, not even, not even veiled capitalism, is sort of the admission that actually you have no idea how you get from the system you've created to the system you claim to be moving towards.
So the party is only for people that are committed to the ideology. The party is...
Yes, as proved by the fact that the party had this idea of just having explicit capitalism in the economy.
People who believe in communism, not people who want to get rich, right?
You mean like Jack Ma and because obviously, it's clearly with the billionaires in the Central Committee and that shit, it's obviously not a place for people who want to get rich. And, I mean, if they believe in communism, then what the fuck is this whole thing with the capitalist economy that they've set up so that people can have social advancement by exploiting workers in a more traditional way?
And President Xi Jinping is cracking down in the party on all kinds of bribery and all that. In China, they've done that, right? If you want to get rich in China, you don't join the Chinese Communist Party, right? If you want to get rich in China,
it doesn't hurt, though.
You go into the private sector. The Communist Party is for people who are loyal to the party line. Cuba is adjusting to be more like this.
Which is to say, moving even farther away from communism. See, what gets me is that, even just the whole Nazbol shit aside, this is the tendency that, more than anyone, act as if they have the answer, the way to get from here to communism. And then when you actually look at the systems that they promote as good examples, every single one of them is moving farther and farther away from communism, and clearly has no idea of how to even reverse that backsliding.
Right? North Korea would like to adjust to be more like this. This is a much better method.
That actually is true. There's been, I talked about this in my video about North Korean music videos, where, first of all, North Korea does have these explicitly capitalist economic zones. They've got one in Kaesong, which is sort of joint production with South Korean corporations, and then they've got one in the Rason, special economic zone on the East Coast, which is just a huge resort area, amongst other things, for Russian tourists, and they also have some joint ventures there. But in the Eighth Party Congress back in February, they very clearly have been moving towards a more orderly system of state capitalism, where the party actually is the main source of authority, and less so a hereditarily determined ruler.
Of purifying the bureaucracy. That the police state stuff under Stalin, it worked for a little while. The Cultural Revolution, pretty much a nightmare, right? That ultimately, the way to make sure that the bureaucracy remains true to revolutionary principles is to make sure that it doesn't become the only place where people can advance.
See, the trouble is, when you have this capitalist notion of advancement, and the more meaningful that is within a society, the less successful you're being in actually approaching communism. Because clearly, that means that your production is still completely based on commodities and based on money. And so there are people who have more of it and people who have less of it, and obviously it is more comfortable to be somebody who has more of it. In other words, the problem is that you've already got an economic system that is completely fucked up if your goal ostensibly is to reach communism.
And this is what we have learned from communism in the 20th century. And this is the question of bureaucracy. A bureaucracy is not a capitalist class. A bureaucracy is a different kind of entity.
Well, except that you've actually kind of admitted through your description that it is
I know there's people in here agreeing with me, there's people in here disagreeing with me, and that's okay. But this is what I'm explaining to you, right? That the problem of bureaucracy, right, is resolved by having a state sector. When you have an overall state central plan, right? When you have
Except, okay, I think he must mean private sector there, but how the fuck does that resolve it? Because the thing is, the private sector is bureaucracy too. It's just less accountable bureaucracy. Every fucking company, every private company, whether it's in China or the US or, one of these joint ventures between North Korea and South Korea and Kaesong in the industrial zone there, that's a fucking huge bureaucracy. It's just not a state bureaucracy necessarily.
overall state central plan, when the means of production are controlled by the state, but you allow people to start their own companies and start their own businesses and start their own hotels and their own restaurants.
Wait a second. If the means of production are controlled by the state, then with what means of production are people starting these independent forms of exploitation?
Their own little tech startups. But the party controls them. That is a mechanism for making sure you don't have this problem that plagued the Soviet Union, of a counter-revolutionary wing of the bureaucracy developing.
Well, by having just a counter-revolutionary class, in addition to a counter-revolutionary bureaucracy. I mean, how is this actually an improvement?
So I hope that answered the question. But yeah, a bureaucracy is not a class. A class and a bureaucracy are two different things. And that, nomenclature existed in the Soviet Union. It exists in China. It exists in Cuba. Every socialist country is going to have, is it nomenclatura, nomenclature? There's correct terms for it.
That's not what nomenclature
that's
means.
going to exist, right? If you're the head of a state-run, look at it. Look at the United States right now. Do you think Pentagon generals don't make huge salary?
Okay. So the idea is that it's not uncommunist to have a class of bureaucratic overlords who exploit the workers for their and benefit directly from it, because the U.S. also does that.
I mean, do you think that the person who's the CEO of PBS, which is a government-funded TV station, I mean, it's like, yes, people...
Barely government funded. I mean, they are so completely dependent on oil money that people call them the petroleum broadcasting system.
People that do very, very important jobs in state-run economies are going to demand that they get paid a lot for it, because they're harder to replace, and they're taking on a huge responsibility, right?
But see, he's given up the entire game here just by drawing this analogy, because the minute you acknowledge that state-owned does not necessarily mean socialist, because it doesn't mean that the working class owns anything, well, then either you're saying that socialism is when the government does it, or you are saying that that none of this necessarily can be used as evidence that any of these economies are socialist.
Right? I mean, and that's as long as there is scarcity. And that's what people don't understand. People say, well, communism, bureaucracy should be separate from ambition. But in China, there are billionaires in the party. Well, wouldn't you rather have the billionaires in the party than outside of the party?
No, actually. Because not when the whole idea of the party supposedly is to have communism in which there will be no billionaires. Because billionaires, as it turns out, have... just stay with me here, Caleb. Billionaires, it turns out, have a direct interest in communism not happening.
Wouldn't you rather have billionaires constantly being held accountable to party standards, right? right? Because the party is held to higher standards of discipline.
Well, what kind of standards does a party have? Does a communist party have if it has billionaires in it?
Right? Then the population,
Like, I mean, the first thing should be no capitalists allowed.
right? If you're in the party and you get caught taking bribes, you're in way more trouble than an average person is for getting caught taking bribes. I mean, I'd rather have billionaires be in the party and be forced to obey the party's discipline than just doing their own thing. I think it's a good thing.
Except the thing is that it turns out that when you accumulate huge amounts of capital, then that also causes causes you to have huge amounts of influence as well. Now, it's true. I'm not going to deny. I mean, it is true that China does have actually a reasonably good record of taking down capitalists who fuck around. Like, there was so the owner of some like baby formula company, I think it was, that was cutting corners on health and safety standards and ended up, I think, getting the death penalty. So it's not that that isn't true, but the thing is that when you have that kind of accumulation of wealth, then you have an accumulation of power, especially because in the end, if you're controlling all this some share of the economy, some share of the means of production, then you will inherently have an amount of influence over the party.
But anyway, but the point that I was making, what was the point I was making? What was the point I was making?
Yeah, you didn't have one.
Oh, right. Is that equality, right? This is the biggest pet peeve of mine. I was taught in school that communism believes that everyone should get paid the exact same wage no matter how hard they work.
Which, yeah, that is wrong, because communism is a stateless, classless, moneyless society, so nobody's getting paid everything because everybody owns everything.
People are like, oh, well, communists want to make everyone equal. Well, look, in the Soviet Union, or in China, or in Cuba, this guy has a lot more money than everybody else, so therefore it's not communist.
Which, okay, wonderful straw man there. That is very droll.
No, it's not rude. Keep super chatting. I like super chats, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, it would. There was some debate over whether he liked having chat messages sent to him in a way that also sends him money.
That's the thing. That's malarkey. No socialist country in the world has had total equality.
Yeah, they also haven't had socialism, unless you're going to say that Scandinavia is also socialist, and Britain in the 1960s was also socialist.
Equality, everyone getting paid the same wage, is not advocated anywhere in Marx's writings. No.
Yeah, well, yes, because the idea is to abolish the wage system.
Nobody in the entire history of the communist movement has said that when we come to power, everyone gets paid the exact same wage. Never. Albania.
Really, nobody? See, I'm pretty sure that's not true. That's not to say that that they're necessarily influential people or they ever came to power, but I'm pretty sure at least some people have actually said that.
Was the only country in socialism that ever came close to that, and even they had 4 different wages, right? Albania,
who was that?
Gets paid the exact same. Nobody in the entire history of the communist movement has said that when we come to power, everyone gets paid the exact same wage. Never. Albania was the only country in socialism that ever came close to that. And even they had 4 different wages, right? Albania, they had 4 pay scales. 4. Okay, so that's very simple, but it's still, they had 4 different pay scales. And the top one and the lower one were definitely not the same. So, you know, the goal is not everyone gets paid the same wage. The goal is to rationally plan out the economy and create vast material abundance. So,
oh, yes, here we go again with this crap.
So that the need for coercion and the need for a wage system at all starts to fade away.
Oh, so yeah, okay. So the idea is that if you constantly force the working class to keep speeding up and increasing their productivity, that communism will just sort of inherently appear.
The road to equality is material abundance. The goal of socialism is with a state-run...
The funny thing about this is this argument... I've heard this, and he would not be flattered by where I've heard this, because Tim Pool's former mini-me weed lord just did what passes in his world for a deep dive, which is to say you really would need a helmet, into Marx. And this was literally the only circumstance in which he could see communism making any kind of sense. So he's got the weed lord seal of approval here with this argument.
Rationally planned economy, you create vast abundance.
We've got vast abundance. And in fact, the idea that abundance in itself automatically is going to result in equality or results in capitalism ending is not something you can really get from Marx, because Marx pointed out his whole discussion of crises in capitalism was how abundance actually in capitalism translates to misery a lot of the time.
Is it because
And we see that right now. There's all sorts of shit that we have more of than we need, and yet roughly half the world's population is hardly getting any of it.
Red Scare propaganda, the Libertarian Party is good third party over the Green Party? Oh, okay. Over the Green Party. But yes, the goal is to create vast material abundance so that class differences and inequality and the need for anyone to hoard anything starts to fade away. That is the basis of it. Like, the goal is not to make everyone equal, right? Libertarian.
Well, except if that's all fading away, then yes, you do end up with equality. It's interesting. He has this sort of mental block when it comes to what communism itself would be.
They always say, "Oh, communists want to make everyone equally poor." No, they don't. They want to make everyone equally rich, and the need.
Well, there we go with that word "equal."
For private property, the need for the need for inequality, the need for people hoarding stuff will fade away as everyone gets wealthy. The goal.
Oh God, I mean, this is okay. So a rising tide floats all boats is what he's come down to here.
Is a world with so much material abundance, so much stuff, that no one feels a need to hoard anything anymore.
Except the thing is that people feel a need to do that because it gives them power over other people. And that doesn't change because there's a huge amount of stuff. If anything, it just means that you have to do more of it in order to achieve the same degree of power.
That is the goal, okay? You read Marx, you read Frederick Engels, Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. The goal is rational state planning of the economy so that we can get to a world in which there is no coercion.
Yes, the fact that people receive wages means you don't have socialism. Thank you. Yes, yes. No fucking shit.
There's so much vast
it's such
material
basic things
abundance. Right? So this idea you have in your head, communism is where everyone gets paid the same wage. Communism is about making everyone equal. Forget it.
Yes, because communism, you don't have wages if there's no money.
The only way everyone can be equal is if you have a huge amount of material abundance. Abundance is what creates that equality.
Then why exactly has abundance and inequality actually risen more or less in tandem in the past half century?
Equality, not the government. Okay, that's you're completely missing it. So people that say the Soviet Union is state capitalist because the bureaucrats had more money,
which is not why anyone says
the average worker have no idea what they're talking about. And that's what I've noticed. A lot of times,
well, yeah, I mean, the people who do say that without any more, without anything else, they don't have any idea what they're talking about. I'll go with that. But the thing is, the people who say this have the sophistication to know that the reason is there's a wage system and commodity production and a capitalist class that just also happens to be much more firmly in bed with the state than in normal capitalist societies.
Trotskyism and, anarchist distortions, a lot of times it's not based on what communists actually think. It's
So the idea, except it is based on what communists actually think, because those people have at least as much claim to being communists as the people that you are willing to acknowledge are communists, Caleb. Now, most of them I would actually which isn't necessarily saying a whole lot, because you got a lot of people in there that clearly really don't give a shit about communism. Yeah, the people that he's saying have nothing to do with what communists think. A lot of them are fucking communists, more
An
so than Caleb could
internalization of
claim to be.
anti-communism. All right.
God, that is the flattest Coke ever.
We can talk about Mosley a little bit. Is internalization of anti-communism, right? There was a friend of mine years ago who had another friend. He was a hardline Stalinist, tanky Marxist-Leninist. And he had a friend who was a Trotskyite. And they were quite friendly. But they realized that probably the biggest disagreement that they had was anti-communism. The Trotskyite, when asked, the question that anyone who believes in socialism or Marx in the United States has to believe is, why in the United States is everyone constantly just really loaded with anti-communism? Why is that? Well,
this is a hard question. There's an entire propaganda system that has been dedicated to bombarding people with it. And what's remarkable is that it isn't working very well anymore, and it never actually worked as well as people thought.
If you asked my friend, who was a ML, who was a tanky, he said, well, that's because of anti-communist propaganda. But according to the Trotskyite, the root cause of anti-communism was reality, was Americans just knew how the Soviet Union was and didn't like it.
Well, except that isn't reality so much as anti-communist propaganda as well. Because when you actually, as Noam Chomsky pointed out, the idea that the Soviet bloc states were communist was a lie that just happened to be convenient to two rival propaganda systems at the same time, because the U.S. could, of course, use it to say, yeah, you don't want communism. Look at how much it sucks over there in the Soviet Union. And of course, the the Soviet Union would say, yeah, you think it sucks? Here, imagine if we didn't have communism here. Now, go and meet your production quota, or we'll dock your wages.
Well, I'm sorry, Americans don't know how the Soviet Union was, right? I was taught my whole life that everyone in the Soviet Union was poor and starving the entire time. Soviet Union.
Wait a second, because you were just saying that you were also taught that there was a wealthy bureaucracy.
Never accomplished anything. I mean, I'm sorry, but no. America.
Is he going to start reading off tractor production statistics again?
Don't know anything about communism. Trotskyites believe that Americans looked at the Soviet Union and didn't like what they saw, and that's why they became anti-communist.
Well, first of all, I don't think that is what Trotskyists as a whole believe. Having, at least amongst the ones that I know, I haven't really heard this the anti-communist propaganda explanation is fairly widespread amongst Trotskyists as well, as far as I've been able to tell. I mean,
MLs believe that what Americans believe about the Soviet Union is based on lies. That's a big difference, right? And that, this whole state capitalism thing, right? I was taught in school that the Soviet government wanted to make everyone equal and give everyone the exact same wage no matter how hard they worked.
Which was giving the Soviet government a hell of a lot more credit than it deserved.
That's not true. But if I
it was never that good.
Kept believing that, and someone pointed out to me the Soviet Union, the guy who runs the steel mill, the state steel industry makes 10 times what the average person makes, or 100 times what the average person makes. I would go, oh, that's not real socialism. Well, I bet if Trotsky had been there, he would have gotten everyone paid equally. That a lot of times,
this is so impressively missing the point. Because the point is, if you've got one guy running the entire industry, you haven't got socialism. It doesn't actually, the income gradients doesn't fucking matter at that point. Because what you don't have is the workers running the industry.
Is rooted purely in not understanding basic facts about what communists believe. It's
except, you're not exactly a great source in what communists believe. since you're not one.
It's believing the lies about communism and trying to, Anyway, I'm sorry, this got a little confusing.
Actually, the funny thing about him saying that, I have to say, is that this is one of the more coherent things of his I've seen. There was...
Imagine wearing a t-shirt or displaying